why would there have been videos of it? Why would the videos of it have been displayed on Ukraine streaming sites?
Well, Judge, you're right. The videos that show Russian prisoners of war being essentially murdered after they've surrendered have been posted by Ukrainian soldiers. These are videos taken by Ukrainian soldiers and then posted on the internet, essentially as a point of pride, in the belief that they are somehow another frightening or horrifying the Russians, who knows. But I also think there's another sinister dimension to this. I think there's an interest in Ukraine, particularly in Kiev, to ensure that there can be no negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. Not so much because of people in Kiev that might be willing to talk, but I think there's growing fear that Washington will ultimately abandon them. They know that Ukraine fatigue is not exclusive to Europe. Ukraine fatigue is certainly having an impact inside the United States. They can read the news. They know that the new Republican Congress may well turn out to be much less willing to support them than the previous one. So under the circumstances, I think they want to make it almost impossible. And one way you do that is by murdering your opponent's soldiers and then posting videos about it, because it so poisons the waters, if you will, with Russia. And it makes it so difficult for the Russians, particularly President Putin, to come to any arrangement, because the Russian people are seeing these things and are incensed. You have Russian military commanders, and frankly, from the beginning, we've accused the Russians of terrible things. They did not do those things. They did not mass rape. They did not mass murder. That's all nonsense. It's all propaganda that the Ukrainians cooked up and then was disseminated across the West and eagerly regurgitated by the Western media, but it was never true.
I'm assuming that what you sent me was real. It certainly looked real.
It's absolutely real. There was another video in the mix, though, that was kind of entertaining because it showed what appeared to be an attempt by the Ukrainians to orchestrate a fake Russian attack on civilians. I mean, and unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess for us, they showed the director of the operation, lights, cameras, and supporting people. And this is being done before by the Ukrainians as well.
All right. Would the mass display of Ukraine war crimes and atrocities on captured defenseless Russian soldiers, boys, have been approved by the high command, or is this some rogue endeavor by the more hardcore of the Ukraine troops? Do you have an answer to that or an idea on that?
If this was a one-off, and then suddenly the Ukrainian government directed that these videos be removed, and then made a statement that they're going to look into this to establish the facts, and if this is in fact true, they will take action. If that had happened, then one would conclude that these were rogue elements, but that has not happened. And so the only conclusion I can reach is that people in Kiev are saying, look, this will keep the war going. This will make it harder for the United States to abandon us because the Russians won't do business. And that's what they currently think is in their interest.
I want to put on the screen a map of Ukraine, which you have seen. In fact, you were gracious enough to send it to us. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to let our viewers take a moment or so to look at it. The red starbursts represent areas where there's been the concentration of Russian missiles and artillery. The blue represent areas of blackouts where there's no electricity or water to speak of. In the sort of lower right of this portion of Ukraine, the striped area represents the area that has been under Russia's control for a while. So let me start going all the way west. Are you surprised that the Russians sent their missiles all the way west? Well, what is the next country over there west? Forgive my ignorance.
Well, west from the map that you're looking at right now, where you see Lvov, Just
Yeah.
west of that, 20 miles, is the Polish border.
Wow. Is it reckless for the Russians to send their missiles so close to the Polish border? Is that a lesson to NATO?
No, it's not reckless at all. First of all, to understand what's happening now, this is very similar to what the United States did in Iraq, to what it did to the Serbs during the Balkan campaigns, the Kosovo Air campaign, very similar to what we did during World War II to Germany and Japan. We systematically identified the networks, the infrastructure for fuel storage, fuel distribution, and today power plants on a grand scale. We did that. We destroyed those places and essentially put countries in the dark and did exactly what you're describing, made it impossible for them to effectively lead normal lives. That was part of the plan. It worked very effectively in Germany. I mean, we were so effective against the fuel refining, storage, and distribution that it brought the Air Force and the Army almost to a standstill in Germany in 1945, certainly by the end of 44. So that's what we're doing now. And this is long overdue. And this is part of the larger plan to prepare Ukraine for the coming offensives. I mean, why would you let your opponent lead a comfortable, leisurely existence if you plan to attack him on a grand scale on the ground?
Right.
And see, before, when this first phase, no one ever completely grasped what Moscow wanted. They wanted an arrangement. They wanted a negotiated settlement. They were not interested in destroying the country. They didn't want to kill large numbers of people. By the middle of the summer, it was clear that's not going to work. So they threw those assumptions out. They went on to essentially a strategic defense, an economy of force mission. Let's use as few forces as possible to hold on to what's ours, and then we'll build up for the offensive. And that's what's been going on. Now it's getting cold finally. So perhaps in 3, 4, 5 weeks or something, we'll see a major offensive.
Gary, can you put the map up again? Colonel, I want to ask you about the sort of lower right-hand portion, if you will,
right,
where you see the gray and black stripes. Now, as I understand the symbols on the map, that reflects the portions of Ukraine which are in which Russian-speaking people live and which the
yes.
Russian government controls.
Yes.
If I'm correct, don't I also see some red symbols there showing Putin attacking that area with either missiles or artillery? How unusual is that? There are Russians living there.
Well, let's not say Putin attacking. You know, he's in Moscow, and
Okay.
these strikes are ordered by the high command of the Russian theater and General Surovikin.
Okay, so the generals in chief are attacking where Russians live. Am I right?
Well, first of all, understand something. Today we have this capability we call strike. Strike is different from what we imagine the standard use for artillery or rockets or missiles might be in the West. The only thing that separates one strike from another is time and space. And we have precision, which means that we could literally, if we saw something in your backyard where you live, Judge, and we thought it was threatening to us, we could target it and destroy everything in your backyard without necessarily harming you. Now, we demonstrated that capability during the Kosovo Air campaign. Some of your viewers will remember that the Albanians in particular were shocked at our ability to attack Serb forces that stood next to or were positioned very close to Albanian homes, but they never damaged any Albanian homes. Well, the Russians can do the same thing. And so there was a decision to attack there, ostensibly because there was some connectivity to this power generation network, and they decided to remove it. Now, beyond that, I don't know the details, but it's eminently capable. They're eminently capable of doing this with great precision. That's why striking those targets that were near the border with Poland was not reckless, because they know they can hit them with absolute precision.
Okay, Gary, put the map up again, please. So, Colonel, if the Russians can move with that much precision, then their strikes around Lviv and Kyiv, which we know destroyed residential areas, were done intentionally, that the destruction of homes and apartment buildings was not a byproduct, it was the goal. Is that fair to say?
No, again, that's not accurate, because the power stations and the power distribution networks were inside those areas.
All
In
right,
other words,
where
they
is the,
didn't decide we just want to level Kiev. I mean, if they wanted to level Kiev, they could do it tomorrow morning. It would take a couple of hours. So they're
where
not.
on the map is the nuclear power plant or nuclear power plants?
Well, the nuclear power plant of greatest interest, of course, is the one to the south in the vicinity of Zaporozhye, which the Russians are protecting. The Ukrainians have repeatedly tried to launch missiles and rockets and artillery rounds against that power station in the hopes of precipitating a nuclear crisis that they think they would benefit from.
All right,
The
right
Russians,
above Zaporozhye, it shows the symbol for an explosion. Then to
yes,
the left of Zaporozhye is the blue symbol for a blackout, and to the right of Zaporozhye is the blue symbol for the blackout. So you're telling us that they want to isolate without destroying and prevent the use of the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye.
yeah, well, it's not a question so much of preventing Ukrainians from using it. They are protecting that plant from Ukrainian attacks. Now, what they have done is that they have removed the connectivity, as you point out, involving the transmission of power from these plants to Ukraine. That has been done, and that will continue to be done. And we ought to pause for a minute and understand the cascading effects of these attacks. This affects everything, every part of life in Ukraine. You're not just talking about transportation and water, of course. You're also talking about rural life where you have herds of cattle, herds of sheep, vast farmlands. Now those animals and the farmland is lying fallow. The animals are dying. They're losing 20, 30% of their livestock, not because the Russians are killing them, but because they can't feed them. They can't move them. They can't sell them. They can't care for them. So the cascading effects are destroying completely the Ukrainian economy. So Ukraine's output is about non-existent now.
So December 1st is 3 days from now. There's already snow on the ground in the northern parts of Ukraine. Where do you see this going in the next 4, 5, 6 weeks, say between now and the first of the year?
Well, the experts on these matters, and I'm not one of them, that know something about the weather and about the terrain in Ukraine. I've seen some of Ukraine, but not all of it. And the Ukrainian black earth topsoil varies from 4 to 12 to 15 feet deep. It depends on where you are. That's why it's such a productive region. You have to freeze that, because if it's not thoroughly frozen, you sink like a rock, whether you're in a truck or you're in a tank. It doesn't make any difference. It's not frozen yet. It's only just now dropped below freezing on a permanent basis. Up till this point, we've had freezing at night, but during the daytime, it's gone back up into the 40s or even 50 degrees. It has to drop below freezing and stay that way for at least 2 weeks. So if it's now below freezing and it stays that way, you can do the math. You're looking for something happening no earlier than the 10th, probably no later than the 19th of December. And you're talking about concentrations of Russian troops all the way around the country. We've accounted now formally by these are the people that sit in front of your monitors that control satellites. And the intelligence community says that it's accounted for 540,000 Russian troops. Okay. And of that 540,000, we're talking about 5,000 armored fighting vehicles, of which at least 1,500 are tanks. Probably another 1,000 self-propelled artillery, the rest infantry fighting vehicles. 1,000 rockets, missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, your so-called drones, unmanned attack systems, 1,000 of those systems. That doesn't even begin to address the hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft, hundreds of helicopters. The helicopters will move troops, obviously. There will be some ground support, hundreds of fixed-wing aircraft operating as close air support, and also bombers now. We've begun to see the use of bombers, which is something we've done for years. They're now beginning to do it, and they all have precision munitions.
Okay, so
which you aim at.
What you've just described must be understood and known by President Zelensky, by Ukrainian intelligence, by American intelligence, by the State Department, by the Pentagon, and by the White House.
Yes.
And what are they going to do about it?
Well, what they're trying to do is they're trying to ship more equipment to the Ukrainians. The problem is the Ukrainian casualties have been horrendous, particularly over the last few months. There was an article today in the Euro News. I'm told there's another one in the New York Times describing the very, very heavy casualties. Of course, the big lie that is always told to accompany the bad news is, well, the Russians have taken heavy casualties too. Nonsense. The Russians have not. And that's the difference. When you're killing your enemy at a 10-to-1 ratio, which is about where it is right now in southern Ukraine with the Russians and Ukrainians, you're not hurting at all. And the Russians, again, aren't running out of anything. The Ukrainians are running out of everything. Ammunition, spare parts, fuel, you name it. Their soldiers, most of the best troops are dead or wounded. And the people that they're shoving forward in the defensive positions are untrained reservists. They say, well, we sent 10,000 more troops to England for 3 weeks. Judge, you're not going to be able to train a man in 3 weeks to do much of anything, or even 5 weeks. You need time. And time is something the Ukrainians no longer have. So the whole thing is on the verge of collapse.
Let's pretend you are back in the Pentagon as you were for a portion of the Trump administration. And Secretary Austin, along with Secretary Blinken, knock on your door. Colonel, what's your advice? What would you tell them? Get the hell out?
I would show them the map and show them the identified concentrations of Russian forces, along with a list of the capabilities, which are impressive in terms of firepower and maneuver. And I would also then bring up a truthful picture of Ukrainian fighting capabilities right now, which are very, very modest. And I would argue, given the terrible conditions that the population faces in Ukraine, it's no surprise that the Ukrainian government is saying leave. Even Klitschko, who is the mayor of Kyiv, has told the population, you really should leave. We're not going to have any power. We won't have water and fuel to heat. You're going to have to go somewhere else and seek shelter. This is the capital city. And millions of these Ukrainians are going to pack it in and they're going to head west. So you're going to have another gigantic mass casualty event, if you will, on Europe's doorstep, with millions of refugees pouring into Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania. And obviously, in many cases, these frontline states will simply herd them further west into other countries because they can't take anymore.
Back to my hypothetical door knocking. What can the American government say to President Zelensky to get him to the negotiating table? You're not getting anything else from us?
First of all, Zelensky will do what you tell him. So if you tell Zelensky the game is up, it's time to come to terms with reality. This is an injustice, a monstrous injustice to the Ukrainian people to fight on at this point. We'll have to accept the fact that a negotiation is necessary. We're going to have to accept that you are seen photographing or visiting Virginia, say in the vicinity of Norfolk, and we are in a state of war. I think we would pick the man up. See, the thing that has to be brought in mind is the Russians are at war. And under those circumstances, it's very foolish to go near any military installation. And that's why I say, if we were at war and we saw people nosing around submarine pens up in Puget Sound or a large Air Force base in Florida, we would pick them up right away.
So Jack Devine, and we'll run a clip from him a little later on, says that the Central Intelligence Agency does not use American journalists to do its dirty work, only foreign journalists. Is it inconceivable that Mr. Hershkowitz was working for American intelligence?
You know, I simply don't know. What I do know is that he would probably willingly turn over any information he found to the CIA because he's very hostile to Russia, just as the CIA is doing everything in its power to keep this operation going in any way, shape, or form it can. It's trying to shape domestic opinion. We know that. It creates the narratives that are widespread inside the United States on everything right now connected to Russia. So Does he work for them? In theory, no. Does that make any difference under the circumstances? Again, Russia is at war. This is an American journalist. He is somewhere close to or en route to a Russian military installation. He's going to get picked up.
Got it. Got it. What is the status of all of the tanks that everybody was all agog about a month or so ago? The German Leopards and the American Abrams. Have they arrived? Are they on their way there? What is the likelihood that they will tip the scales ever so slightly in favor of the Ukrainians?
Well, as far as I know, the numbers of American M1 series tanks have not arrived. I don't know when they're going to show up, but they're certainly in the process of being readied for, use by the Ukrainians. The Leopards have shown up, as have some of the other pieces of equipment, and of course the Bradleys. They're not really tanks. That's an armored fighting vehicle, but it does have a 25 millimeter chain gun on it that's very lethal. I don't know if they also are going to equip them with TOW missiles. That's also a lethal missile under the right circumstances. I think what people are discovering is that the Russians have a number of missiles. One of them is called the Coronet. And this Coronet missile can be fired from 5,000 meters away or potentially even further. It's self-guiding. Once you sight the target, you can essentially fire and forget it. And if that warhead reaches a tank, any tank, it will destroy the tank. It doesn't make any difference what it is. So that that is something that I guess people are now beginning to notice, because the Coronet missiles were used against Leopard tanks in Syria. And people should be very concerned about that. Again, this is something I think other analysts have said. It's not an individual weapon system. It's not the arrival of 200 tanks or 500 tanks that are going to make any difference. It's the integration of various types of equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, various missile carriers, air defense, air and missile defense. For instance, there's a 30 millimeter automatic cannon linked to radar that's excellent, that's produced by Rheinmetall. I would say you'd probably need a couple of hundred of them on the battlefield just to protect yourself from all the various unmanned aerial systems. So the bottom line is, no, this isn't going to change anything.
Do the tanks have some sort of a weaponry or equipment in their skin, for lack of a better word, a lay phrase, to neutralize the weaponry that attacks them?
Well, they have what you would call active versus passive defense. An active defense system can be all sorts of things. It can be small explosives embedded in ceramic and metal tile that is applied on the outside of the tank's armor. There are different kinds of this thing. You actually can put radar on the tank itself that detects an incoming missile. All of this stuff exists. The problem is twofold. First of all, most of that active equipment only works once. In other words, once you've struck the tank once, you don't have that protection anymore. In other words, you get a direct hit.
Right.
If you strike it twice, you may get something more, but then you're essentially naked. It only gets you through a couple of initial fights. Okay. Secondly, we don't have anything right now to deal with what I would call top attack. In other words, a missile that comes in and strikes on top of the turret. This has been a threat for a long time. In other words, it comes in and it dives down on the top of the turret where the armor is thin. The Israelis are looking at a number of very innovative ways to change that can be integrated into future armored fighting vehicles.
Do the Russians have missiles that will do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, so do the Germans. And they have not released any of those. We've been working on those, and I think we have some, if they're not already fielded in the U.S. military, and they may or may not be, I don't know. They certainly are in development. These are the new threats that are changing the nature of warfare. This is what effectively robs you of your mobility on the battlefield. And it robs you of your ability to use all of this armor that historically we've relied on to come to terms with the enemy, to go right in and kill the enemy at close range. It's not going to be solved quickly. It's sort of like World War I, when suddenly people discovered machine guns, artillery, and mines, and barbed wire and trenches, and the maneuver stopped. We're in a similar conundrum. It won't last forever, and we're going to have to find a way through it. But the bottom line is we're not really prepared for it.
The head of the Wagner Group has proclaimed that Bakhmut has fallen. President Zelensky has not refuted that. It seems to me, as a layperson in the military world, 10,000 miles away, that it's safe to say that Bakhmut has fallen. Do you have any intel on this?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Prigozhin made a number of interesting remarks.
That's the head of the Wagner Group.
Of the Wagner Group, right. And Prigozhin said something that many of us have suspected was the case for months, but now we've had it from the horse's mouth, and I think it's probably true. And that is that Surovikin, the general that was brought in the early fall, late summer last year to change the command structure and the way the Russians were operating,
right,
decided to turn Bakhmut into what it became, a bloodbath, a meat grinder. So they were deliberately leaving Bakhmut partially surrounded, and in the hopes that more and more and more Ukrainian forces would be poured into it that could be systematically destroyed. That's the way it looked to me for a long time.
And is that the way it worked out?
Yes, absolutely. It's been brilliant for the Russians. This is the best thing that could have possibly happened to them. And one of the things that people don't understand is, well, why didn't they just cut this off and be done with it? Why aren't they doing that? Well, there's a reason. Because if your enemy comes to you, and I just described the battlefield that we're on now, which is not very favorable or friendly to large maneuver forces. So you have to infiltrate into this World War I setting. If that's what you're operating on, you're just doing what your enemy wants you to do. And I think Surovikin was the man behind that. And that's effectively what Prigozhin said. Now, they say that all but a few blocks, something like 11% of the sort of built up area of Bakhmut is absolutely devoid of Ukrainians, but there's still some left on the edge. And you still have talk, as we talked about the last time when we put the map up, you still have talks of 80,000 troops breaking through in or around or near Bakhmut in some fashion. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but there's still a lot of talk about that. So perhaps you leave the door open one more month and let more people, essentially convert themselves into corpses by going in there.
We just interviewed Jack Devine just about a half an hour ago, and he had some comments about the Russians and Bakhmut that either will affect your blood pressure or cause you to have some fun with them. Here's what he said.
In the last 2 months, you were telling me these great wizards of the war were saying the Russians have the 300,000 man army and they're going to roll right over Ukraine. Here we are, 150,000 troops went in, and they may or may not have taken a town. I mean, he is having a hard time. This is not victory. Anybody that thinks he's won something, God bless you. But I mean, I don't know how I could hold my head and invade a country and move a few kilometers, So I think he's in trouble. I think he's in serious trouble. That's why there's a fight between the regular military and the Wagner Group.
He, of course, to whom he refers is President Putin.
Well, Judge, what do you want me to say? I think Jack is entertaining to listen to, but I think he's got a severe problem with cranial rectal defilade. Thanks, Jack, for your interest in national defense. The other thing I would say is, and this is something else that people aren't paying attention to, but they should right now, the bridges over the Dnieper up in Zaporizhia and further north. These are major bridges that you can drive, 18-wheelers, tanks, anything you want across these bridges over that river. They're all intact. And the Russian citizenry has asked several times, why don't you destroy these and stop those Ukrainians from crossing that river? Well, the Ukrainians aren't crossing the river in very great strength anymore because they've killed most of them. They're trying to put together this big counterattack. We'll see what comes of it. I have serious doubts that it's going to amount to much. I think it's just going to get a lot of people killed. So why haven't they destroyed those bridges, Judge? Is it Jack Devine's perception that, the Russians just aren't very bright? They haven't done their battlefield assessment. They they're not acting. Well, I don't agree with that. I think the Russians plan to use those bridges
themselves. I
Yes.
mean, what prompted the ridiculous comments from Jack was my inquiry about Bakhmut falling. And first he denied it, and then he said he had heard the rumors that it fell, and then he said it's just one little town. Well, you and I and the thousands that watch us when you're on this show looked at the map and saw how central and how critical that town is. And now you've told us that the Russian strategy has not only been to secure the town, but to use it as the jaws of death, if I may, for the Ukrainian troops that were foolish enough to be flooded into those jaws.
Well, Ukrainian commanders, we know, have begged Zelensky to let them get out. They described it exactly as it is, a meat grinder. They were just losing people. We've been through these discussions. The average lifespan for someone new to the front is, what, 4 hours? This is insane. So I think the Ukrainians knew that. The larger issue, and I you know, Jack is basically giving you the standard narrative, and that's fine.
Right.
And everybody's doing that in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. Every once in a while, a little bit of truth creeps in. But the bottom line is that no one is moving a lot anywhere until the mud goes away. And, you know, you try to explain to Americans that this stuff is like slogging your way through 10 feet of slime that sticks everything, that stops everything. Americans can't even begin to imagine it. The only place I've seen in the United States we come close to it is in southern Texas, where you have something they call caliche. It's a real thick earth that becomes mud and does something similar. But even it pales before what we're dealing with in.
Is this unique to Ukraine? And is this possibly what makes the Ukraine earth, dirt, so fertile for growing wheat?
No, I think so. I think when you're talking about what, 10 to 15 meters deep in most places, this black earth, it's very rich, that will grow anything.
Right.
Throw anything in it, it grows.
When the Ukrainian military superiors are foolish enough to send their troops into a meat grinder or the jaws of death, does American intel know about this, even military intel? Are they warned about it? Or do the Ukrainians do it anyway because of this vain effort to die fighting?
Well, now you're moving into an area where, you know, we just don't know. I mean, I'm sure some of your former intelligence officers that you've spoken to can give you a better picture. My experience is that, first of all, if you've already decided what the outcome is going to be, which is the case in Washington, that Russia is going to be defeated, humiliated, and driven east out of Ukraine forever and ultimately capitulate and give up Crimea, if you believe that, then a whole lot of things don't work well. And one of those is that you may just ignore what comes up to you that doesn't conform to your preconceived ideas. That's always been a problem. We went through that in Vietnam for years.
This morning in Moscow, President Putin addressed publicly the new U.S. ambassador to Moscow. There were other Western ambassadors there as well. And he basically blamed the war on the United States and articulated in public his view, a view you and I share, and most people watching us now share, I think, that the U.S. was responsible for the coup in Ukraine in 2014, the so-called color revolution. And the U.S. started all of this and thus is largely responsible for it. I don't know that President Putin has been that direct, that public about this before.
Well, I think he certainly made the larger case. He hasn't been specific about the so-called coup, but there's a huge mountain of evidence to support what he's saying. And by the way, you now have Mr. Netanyahu in Israel, who is absolutely convinced that we're running a quote unquote color revolution against him and his government.
Well, you're a question ahead of me as to whether, God bless you, Colonel, whether you believe that the Central Intelligence Agency was responsible for massive, persistent, endless demonstrations in the streets in Jerusalem and Israel over the makeup of the Israeli judiciary.
Well, you have this thing called the National Endowment for Democracy that is all over the place. And the National Endowment for Democracy should probably be renamed Color Revolution Headquarters for the subversion and installation of new governments that are subservient to, responsive to U.S. will. I mean, that was clearly going on in Kazakhstan in the first few weeks of this Ukrainian disaster. You'll recall the Russians sent a lot of special forces in there to help the government recover itself. It's been the case in any number of places. I think that's one of the reasons that Lukashenko has effectively signed on 100% for Putin, because you had the same outfit working in Minsk.
Right.
This is not new. Now, is the CIA involved with that? Of course.
Right. How else could it have happened? Well, President Putin was speaking directly into the eyes of the American ambassador in Moscow. President Zelensky was visiting one of his staunchest allies in Poland. We have a little clip there. There's the president of Poland, and there's President Zelensky. What more can the Poles give him short of troops on the ground, which we know is what he wants?
Well, now we've got another problem in the region. All of these, well, I shouldn't say all, but most of the states in Central East Europe that border Russia or are close to it in any way have agendas. We've got to remember that Poland, after World War I, regained much of its territory that it had lost in the 1790s. It would like to do the same thing again. Remember that Stalin's great gift to the Europeans was to shove millions of Germans further west, then shove millions of Poles into places that were historically German, at least for 1,000 years. And this had a wonderful effect because it forced the Germans away from Russia, but it also created in Stalin's mind permanent conditions of hostility between the Germans and the Poles for the territorial changes that he imposed on them.
Right.
Hungary lost vast territory at the end of the Second World War. The Kingdom of Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
They controlled vast lands that are now occupied by the Romanians. Some are occupied by the Serbs. Some are occupied today by Croats. Some are occupied by Slovaks. So you go back into these countries and you begin to talk to people, and just because you lost a war, just because you weren't on the winning side 100 years ago, you have to understand these people. They were dominant powers for centuries, dominant not just in economic or military terms, but also culturally, linguistically. You get the same thing when you go to Iran. You know, very few people understand it. From the Chinese border all the way to the border with Russia and Ukraine, the language that was spoken on the so-called Silk Road was Persian.
All right. Well, while we're talking about cultural, are there cultural rumblings now in Kosovo?
Yes. Yeah, that's another terrible wound. It's another example of where we intervened. We created an artificial construct that was forced into existence that otherwise would never have been tolerated in the region. Remember,
Yugoslavia?
Yeah. Well, remember that Yugoslavia fell apart. That too was inevitable because the majority of people that were Roman Catholics or Muslim certainly did not want to live under Orthodox Christian Serbs. You know, that's another gift from World War I. It was a dumb idea. We're going to force people that have been either allied or ruled by Catholic Germans for 1,000 years into the arms of Christian Orthodox Serbs. It's crazy, but we did it. So that fell apart. And then we decided, well, all of these people must be compelled to live together in the new multicultural, multinational, multi, whatever it is, paradise that we in Washington are creating. And the whole world will learn this is the way it must be. Well, this is all nonsense. Kosovo is part of Serbia and has been part of Serbia for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They lost it a couple of times and they regained it. And they fought very hard during the Balkan Wars to get it away from the Ottoman Turks. If you're Greek, if you're a Bulgarian, if you're Romanian, if you are Serbian, the presence of large Muslim populations that were essentially created by the Turks, and separate governments and institutions that were installed by the Turks. They're very uncomfortable with this. And given what we experienced in 2001, you can imagine the paranoia flag went to full mast. It's still there. So Islamist terrorism, Islamist assassination programs, gangsterism, call it what you will, is run out of Kosovo to a large extent. It's a clearinghouse. A lot of those missing weapons from Ukraine show up in Kosovo and end up going to North Africa, down into the Arabian Peninsula, somewhere
Didn't
else.
we bomb the daylights out of Kosovo in the Clinton administration?
Well, we bombed
Mrs. Albright wanted sort of an American-controlled caliphate.
Yeah, well, that's largely it. You've got to go back to Albright and Al Gore, Sandy Berger, Strobe Talbot. These are all figures in the church of moralizing globalism, and they wanted to create this new paradise. And so we bombed them for 78 days. And of course, this had a hugely negative impact on all the Orthodox Christians that live in the region, because from their standpoint, we're backing an Islamist element in their neighborhood that they personally revile and detest. And we're doing it at the expense of Orthodox Christians. I mean, in that part of the world, you cannot be everyone's friend. If you side with anybody, you become instantly enemies for everybody else.
Of course.
And then we created this mess, and this mess's fault is gradually beginning to unravel.
At the same time that we just the president just authorized another $2.58 billion today in military equipment to be shipped to Ukraine. He has no off-ramp, Colonel.
No, that's
no political off-ramp, no moral off-ramp. He doesn't possess a moral off-ramp. I don't know how this is going to end. What do you see happening in the next 6 months?
Well, absolutely. And again, this reinforces another point, that the Europeans did not sign up for a war with Russia. When this whole business began, and I say business, I'm talking about going back to 2014 with the installation of the government that was essentially friendly to us, guided by people like Victoria Nuland and others from Washington. And then the subsequent massive buildup of the Ukrainian army, designed effectively for one purpose, to attack Russia, specifically not just to attack Russia, but to regain control of Crimea. So this was an unambiguously offensive force aimed at Russia. I think the Europeans looked at this and said, well, this won't really go anywhere. The Russians really don't want to fight, and the Russians are no longer armed as they once were. And what we're discovering is that they were not entirely wrong, that the Russian military was hardly prepared for a major war, which is why they ultimately went to the strategic pause, the economy of force. And they went to a war footing. They're now on a war footing. Their factories are running 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They're not in any danger of running out of ammunitions or equipment or anything else. And they're turning out excellent equipment, brand new equipment in many cases. It's arriving very rapidly at the front. They now have a very large force, and it's getting larger every day. So I think the Europeans just never signed on for this. And the problem we have right now is that we grossly miscalculated on the Russians. We don't really understand them. We didn't pay any attention to them. We're staring strategic defeat in the face.
Have our supplies been depleted, and
Absolutely.
Are they in need of replenishment, the Americans, to the same extent that NATO's are?
Well, of course, you got to remember that if you look at something like the Javelin, a friend of mine at Raytheon told me that, and this was ultimately posted by Fox News in one of the articles, but a friend at Raytheon said, look, we've gone through almost 7 years of production of Javelins in Ukraine. It takes time to build these missiles, whether it's HIMARS or Raytheon's other products like NASAMS and so forth. All of these missiles are very complex, high-tech weapons. We've gone through our stockpiles very quickly, and we have no surge capacity, none. And that's something people don't understand. But the Russians have managed to very rapidly surge production. And the Europeans are very concerned about it. That's why inside NATO, behind closed doors, people are saying, this can't go on. You've got to end this, Washington. Everyone's at risk. We have nothing left. In fact, the whole tank issue is blowing up in everybody's faces because the tanks are simply not showing up. Suddenly, other European members are reluctant to commit their Leopard tanks. And if I were sitting in their shoes right now, I would feel the same way. Why would I send my armor over there? I might, in their minds, they say, well, once Ukraine is destroyed, we have to be able to defend ourselves. And I think they're right.
To this argument, late last week, General Christopher Cavoli, I don't know if you know him, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, an American general, was quoted as saying Ukraine's losses are, quote, out of proportion to NATO's expectations. Now, that's consistent with what you're saying, but I'm surprised to hear that from General Cavoli, unless this is the type of leak that's intended to acclimate the public to reality.
That could be. Cavoli is the Supreme Commander, Europe, and what he says is certainly going to have a huge impact in Europe. Most people in the United States won't pay any attention, but everybody in Europe will. And so in that sense, you could be right that he's signaling that this is not going to go on. We cannot sustain this. He's not going to come out and say it, but I think that's his message. Would
someone of General Cavoli's position, an American four-star, but commanding American and foreign troops to the extent that he's commanding them, you can tell me what that means, in Europe, have needed the permission of the State Department or the Defense Department or the West Wing to make a statement that profound?
Absolutely. It would have to have been vetted in the White House as well as with the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I suspect the Secretary of State.
He also used a phrase, and maybe this is military science 101, I don't know. Precision can beat mass. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, I did not necessarily use that.
No,
phrase.
You didn't use it. General Cavoli did.
Yeah. Cavoli is not wrong. What you need, though, is the following. Wars are won and have been won, certainly for the last century plus, by accurate, devastating firepower. Your ability to direct accurate, devastating firepower against the enemy at a place and time and space that makes his position hopeless. Let's put it that way. We have precision. Unfortunately for us, so do the Russians. So do the Chinese. This monopoly that we had for years on precision munitions is gone. Now what the Russians are demonstrating is that they understand that you need both. You want precision munitions, precision missiles, precision rockets, but you want huge quantities of them if you're going to win. So Cavoli is trying to sort of be on both sides of the equation. He said, well, precision can beat mass, yes, under certain circumstances. But if your opponent has precision and mass, probably not. And that's the case with Russia right now.
Wow. You and I also talked about some of the behavior of Ukrainian agents and recruiting officials. I don't know if they're military or not, lowering the conscription age to 16. Now, everywhere in the world, a 16-year-old boy is a boy, not a man, not a fully developed man, and too young for the military, but I guess not too young for Ukraine. You and I shared a video. I don't know how old this kid was, 14 or 15, was literally kidnapped right in front of his mother's eyes and shoved into a military truck. They were just walking down the street. What is this going to do for the morale of the people in Ukraine? Is it common or is it isolated? And has the conscription age in Ukraine, this is almost child abuse, been lowered to 16?
My impression is yes, it has. And there are multiple sources confirming that this is the case. And there's lots of evidence being posted by Ukrainians all the time about the true situation. There are pictures of Ukrainian soldiers that are obviously, 15, 16 years of age. So there's no doubt that this is going on. But I think this is part of the larger picture. The Russians went into this economy of force, And they maximize the effectiveness of their connectivity between space-based and terrestrial-based ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, assets above, and gun systems, rocket systems, missile systems. They've inflicted terrible casualties. Whole year groups of Ukrainian men are dead and are gone, have been annihilated. And at the same time, you have this much smaller population from which to draw on, as I talked about previously. There aren't 37 million people in Ukraine anymore. The areas that Zelensky controls, there are perhaps 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 million, which is roughly the size of the population of the Netherlands. That population is mostly male, I'm told, because lots of old men, women, and children have left the country. But still, the men that are there are not all able. Some of them are at advanced age, and lots of them are children. And so they're in desperation turning to this. This regime is at the end. It really is. But it's not going to give up. It's going to fight to the bitter end, and it's going to sacrifice whatever it can to stay in power.
But when will Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin and Jake Sullivan, the people that presumably are making these decisions, recognize what you just said, that the regime is at the end?
I think that for all intents and purposes, that message was delivered weeks ago from the Department of Defense to the White House, and it was rejected. Period.
Well, they're rejecting reality in deference to their political needs. Well, we'll hear that in the State of the Union tonight.
Well, I'm sure you'll hear an entirely erroneous picture. I mean, someone asked me today, how did we end up like this? I said, well, we've had 40 years of Cold War, at the end of which the Soviet Union fell apart and we emerged, if not victorious, then certainly healthy and well, and we avoided global war, which was our goal for 40 years. In just 1 year, we faced defeat in Ukraine through this proxy war, but more important, we're on the threshold of a potential confrontation with Russia, something that we worked for decades to avoid. So I guess the answer to your question, Judge, is it doesn't look good. We're not going to admit failure. No one will say they were wrong.
The Russians love anniversaries. February 24th, of course, is the anniversary of the beginning of this military incursion. From your sources, Colonel, does President Putin have his hundreds of thousands of reinforcements ready to pour in to eastern Ukraine and begin marching and killing and destroying on their way west?
Yes, they're ready. That's why I thought that by now they would have already pulled the string, so to say, and have moved north. But the shaping attacks that have been going on down in southern Ukraine have essentially set the Russians up for multiple axes of advance from the south, up towards Zaporozhye, up through the Bakhmut area, and further east up along the border with Russia. I don't know which one they're going to take. Maybe they'll take them all, but that has worked. Why they have not already attacked, who knows? I mean, one thing I'm sure Sorovikin realizes and Gerasimov realizes is that their strategy of enticing the Ukrainians to attack them relentlessly has worked. Ukraine has been bled white. And they may be saying, well, there's no reason to rush. We can wait another 3 or 4 days. Let's wait for additional ammunition. Let's wait for additional whatever it might be. Remember, logistics is important. And they want to push forward ammunition, medical support, more firepower, all of those kinds of things. And it may be they want to push some more forward. But the truth is they could go right now, and there's not much to stop them from going straight north and on the eastern side all the way to Kiev.
Have you seen any evidence of demoralization amongst the Ukrainian troops because of their vast casualties?
Anecdotally, you go on Telegram and you look at the things that are being posted in Ukrainian by Ukrainians, and yes, there's plenty of evidence for it. There's no question about that. Also, the hatred and hostility is growing for Zelensky, as more and more Ukrainians are blaming him for the
just let me stop you. Is this hatred from the public, Ukrainian public, from the military, or both?
Well, I'm talking primarily about soldiers in the field, but that may also apply to the population. I just don't have access to that in Western Ukraine. I don't know what they think there. But soldier-wise, oh, absolutely. And they're also looking at very corrupt leadership. You know, there are comments coming in all the time. You're stuffing your pockets with cash, you and the generals, your corrupt leaders, and we're dying, by the bushel every other day. I mean, assignment to Bakhmut for the last couple of months has been essentially a death warrant, and everybody knows it.
Not too long ago, maybe 3 or 4 days ago, the former foreign minister of Poland revealed that at one point the Polish government was thinking of, I don't know how they would do this physically, militarily, and legally, partitioning Ukraine and considering the western part of Ukraine, the part largely untouched by the war that includes the capital, Kyiv, as a Polish protectorate, and thereby triggering Article 5, the obligation of all of NATO to defend Poland, if that part of Ukraine, a la Polish protectorate, were attacked by Russia. I mean, this just sounds, to me, crazy. It almost sounds like the justification Hitler used to combine Austria to Germany to protect Austria, even though the only people Austria needed to be protected from was him.
Although most Austrians disagreed, and they were quite happy to join the German state. I think Hitler's a bad comparison.
Okay.
I think a better comparison would be somebody like Stalin, the man that murdered 16 times the number of people Hitler ever encountered. I think Poland is another state in the region with unfinished business. You've got to go all the way back to the First World War and understand the Second World War was an extension of the First. And then all of the people in the region that were formerly part of Austria-Hungary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even the German imperial state or Prussia, all these places fell under Russian domination, Russian communist domination. And everyone was unhappy with it. Everyone hates it, and everyone felt betrayed. The Poles in particular, once they got out from under Soviet occupation and control, always envisioned a time when they would regain their former stature in Europe as a great power. So these kinds of thoughts and strategies have been around forever. The problem is, if they are seriously considering this, and they may be, I mean, it's hard for us to know, but nothing would surprise me. The Poles are romantics to the bitter end. If they think that by moving into Ukraine and claiming that they are acting in the name of NATO and Washington, that'll be the end of NATO. The Europeans will say, you've had it, you're on your own. We're not bankrolling your war to regain your empire against Russia.
Well, we already know that the president of Poland has said his goal would be to claim back Crimea. Now, that is an impossibility, and it's insanity.
Yeah, but you mean Ukrainian president, right?
No, the Polish president.
Oh, he wants to recapture Crimea?
Yes. He wants American troops and his troops and Ukrainian troops to recapture Crimea. This is an impossibility, and I think you'd agree with me. It's insanity for him to say that.
Well, he's obviously on hallucinogenics of some kind that would make him billions of dollars if he could mass produce it. But no, I don't see any evidence for that happening. And again, look at everybody else involved. And I guess you have to make exceptions for people that live in northern Norway that think that might be great, who are on the edge of the West and are totally remote from reality. You may have some of those in England. I don't know. But everybody else on the continent of Europe will walk away from that. There's no chance of that. And that's the end of NATO. People just say, wait a minute. No, we're not joining this war on Russia. Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Is there any chance, no matter what Washington does, that Ukraine can win this war?
Well, of course.
Or that Putin can lose it?
No, of course not. No. Putin isn't going to lose anything. And so, somebody said, well, Putin is weakened and adrift. I said, you mean Joe Biden? They said, no, Putin. I said, no, Joe Biden, not Vladimir Putin. The Russians have a strategy. They know what they're doing. They're methodical. They're deliberate. They're effective. We don't. We never thought through the consequences of our actions. We're all sitting around here in Washington saying, oh, what do we do now? Ukrainians are going to lose. We can't have that. We've got to ship more over to them. What do we do? See, this has been my concern from day one, that then people who are rank amateurs are saying, well, we've got to do something. Maybe we can move into Western Ukraine, just out to Lvov, and set up a safe zone. I don't think it's going to go down very well with the Russians at this point. You can't tell your opponent, you must be humiliated. Your state must be dismembered, and your government must be destroyed. Then we will kindly accept your surrender and welcome you into the brotherhood of international globalism or something. But that's effectively what we've been saying. So if you're a Russian right now, you're looking at this and saying, we're just going to keep going until there's nobody left in Ukraine that opposes us. And I'm afraid that's the path they're on. And I don't see any evidence that we're going to try to seriously arrest it.
What will it take, in your mind, for Zelensky to call up Tony Blinken and say, let's start some back channel communications with the Russian foreign minister, because this can't go on much longer? Or is he not the type of rational person to do that? Or is Blinken not the type of person to accept that?
I think Blinken and the president would have to assure Zelensky that he and his inner circle will be flown immediately to Miami or Malibu or somewhere, and ensconced in wealthy homes and surroundings, and live comfortably for the rest of their lives, in which case he might do that. But otherwise, forget it.
All right. I want to switch gears just a little bit. Colonel, where on the planet is the largest gathering